Welcome to this episode on Jesuit historical tracks. This time around we want to hear the story of Musami. Fr Nigel Johnson will take us through that story. Nigel, how did the Jesuits end up at Musami Mission?
Well, that goes back to, it's quite a bit of history involved. I think the mission was first started around 1920, 22, 23, something like that.
Right.
But there's quite an interesting and quite a funny story, well, quite a tragic story, a funny story, that I read in the Jesuit archives.
Okay.
Not quite sure where the full story comes from, but it's there.
Right.
And I thought it was very interesting and very likely to be the case. It goes back to Chishawasha Mission and Father Rickards.
Yes.
It was Rickards who was, yes.
That's right.
And a real historical event for sure, which was the whatever you call it, the first Chimurenga, the uprising, which was put down.
Right.
But a lot of young guys were captured and imprisoned, and Father Rickards apparently interceded for them and said, look, send them, I will look after them, I will ensure that they behave themselves or whatever, to persuade the authorities to let them out of prison and come and settle in Chishawasha.
Okay.
Because the early idea there seems to have been they wanted to have a Christian village.
Okay.
Where, you know, everybody keeps the rules and everybody behaves and it's full of love and kindness and generosity and all these lovely things that we've been trying to achieve in the world for the past million years. But then, of course, there was a problem, because when these young guys, you know, got a bit older, they get married, and that was fine.
Yes.
But, you know, within the culture, especially the culture of the time, they would take a second wife and maybe a third wife.
Right.
Well, of course, for Father Rickards, this was completely unacceptable. One man, one wife, you know.
Monogamy.
Yes. So they were told, unfortunately, they could no longer stay in this Christian village sort of thing.
Right.
So they moved and resettled, well, somewhere up towards Murewa.
Right.
I know many of them, I think, settled around a place called Chemondoro, which is close to Musami, but others a bit further. Anyway, Father Rickards, a very kind man, went to visit them to see how they were doing, and he'd travel, I suppose, on his ox cart. I don't know, maybe it was on his horse. I don't know how he travelled. And they were very happy to see him, and he was happy to see them, and I don't know, they talked of this and that. So they said, I don't know if you can help us, Father, because our fields are being troubled by a terrible baboon, a great big baboon, which brings all his family and all his children. They all come and eat our crops. So Father Rickards said, well, I could probably get hold of my gun and go and shoot this animal.
Right.
So off they went, and he shot the baboon. So he came back. Must have gone with a group of them, came back and said, well, now, here, you've got some meat to eat.
Oh.
And but the people said, oh, well, we don't eat baboon. That we couldn't possibly eat baboon, no. But you know, there's the guy over there, Mr. Musami. He likes a nice leg of baboon. Why don't you go and see him? So Father Rickards went down and met Mr. Musami, and indeed, Mr. Musami was very happy to accept a leg of baboon, and they became friends.
Right.
And, you know, after a time, Mr. Musami said, oh, well, couldn't you set up a school here to teach our kids?
Right.
Can't you bring the sisters, set up a clinic here to deal with health issues? And that's basically the beginning of Musami Mission. This is the story which is written. I don't know what the source of the story is. It might be myth, it might be legend, but I like to think it's probably
A story
true.
to go by. Right?
Yeah.
What would you consider as the works that have been associated with the Society of Jesus at Musami Mission in particular?
It's like most of these missions. When I say most of these missions, Mondoro, Makumbi, etc., in the sense that, it started in those days where there must have been a small school, perhaps, don't know who the teachers were, probably teaching people, kids to read and write. But it obviously developed, so there's a day secondary school, there's a day primary school, which has gradually increased in its size. The primary is about 1,000 day pupils walking each day. Right. Secondary is about 600 boarders with a certain number of day pupils from the local area. Some years ago, when I first came there, which is obviously a long time ago because I was quite a young guy, I was a scholastic then, the sisters ran a homecraft school for girls. I think at that time it was quite difficult for parents to agree to send their girls for secondary education. But to learn homecraft, whatever that is, it was, was acceptable. But that faded out. Hospital, always run by the Dominican sisters until a few years ago.
Okay. You worked in the hospital sometime?
Yes, I worked in the hospital. When I came out as a scholastic, Father Mark Hackett appointed me the matron.
Okay.
Which I'd never been a matron, I didn't know much about that. But then subsequently I developed the dental surgery side of things. And then we came to the war, the Liberation War, when all sorts of injured people came in and didn't want to go anywhere near a government hospital.
Okay.
Some of them were guerrillas, some of them were mujibas, all that sort of thing. Yeah. So we had to deal with them. We had no other doctor. I'm a dentist by profession. Okay. So I just had to extend my repertoire of what things I could deal with. So I was there for quite a long time. Okay. Eventually we now have, I think they've got 3 doctors now.
Okay. So now, during the Liberation War, I think it was in 1977, there was a massacre at Musami Mission.
There was.
What's your take on that?
Well, the story of what happened is quite clear. A group of guys, armed guys, came into the mission, rounded up the fathers, one of the brothers, the sisters, lined them up, didn't tell them what they were taking them to, and then just opened fire with an AK-47, bang, 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 and killed all of them except for one. So they killed 4 Dominican sisters and 3 Jesuits. The question always still remains as to who exactly these guys were. There are 2 main theories. One is that they were Zanla guerrillas, or they were Selu scouts, in other words, Rhodesian forces, pretending to be Zanla guerrillas in order to discredit the Zanla guerrillas and to probably disrupt the relationship between the church and the guerrillas. Which version, it depends really on what you want to believe, frankly. Definitely, though, from later years, when we had, we developed actually very good relations with the Zanla guerrillas. This is, about 2 or 3 years later. They used to come into the mission, they'd come and they would, we'd talk to them and they'd hold pungwes with the school kids and they would come into the common room and have a drink and play music. And, we had very good relations there. We used to go out and see them and give them some simple medicines, which they would then bring to the people, simple medicines, not antibiotics, but all, very simple things. And they say they brought them from Mozambique, but they hadn't actually. They'd been given by the local mission hospital. But on one occasion, we had a guerrilla who had been injured, been shot quite seriously, but we managed to more or less stick him together, and he's doing very well. And then one night, a group of guys turned up, saying that they were his comrades, Sandler people, who'd come to take him away. And they did take him away, but it turned out that they were not Sandler. They were Selous scouts pretending to be Sandler. So that theory, you know, that these were Selous scouts is okay, you know, maybe. Or the other one would be simply that it was some group that had a grudge against the mission. It could be one of the guys could have been expelled from school or something like that. Or that's the other theory. But there's actually nobody has ever come up with any evidence.
Okay.
I mean, one feels that there must be some old people still living around that area that knew something. And there are stories, you know, rumors, but there's no clear evidence.
Okay.
So people tend to believe what they want to believe.
Okay. Now, in more recent days, I'd imagine the Jesuit Development Office supports some projects at Musami Mission. Which ones we thought?
Yeah, we've done quite a lot with regard to the hospital, the infrastructure of the hospital,
Right.
in terms of, you know, putting new roofs on old buildings which are quite solid,
Yes.
but the roofs, you know, were sort of curving like that, so that the rain would come. So we've managed to replace the roofs there, and also getting a whole lot of equipment, fixing the X-ray machine, you know, that sort of stuff. It has a certain lifespan,
Yes.
needs spare parts or needs replacing, and then some laboratory equipment as well, which, you know, I mean, it always gets upgraded, gets more sophisticated, and one wants to keep up to date, so we've managed that. But the other thing is the Pedro Arrupe Centre.
Who started that one?
That was started by Brother Canisius Chishiri. Now, he's a very interesting character.
Right.
I first met him during the Liberation War, when he was in Chitunguiza, early Chitunguiza,
Right.
and he had what he called his screaming women. These were women who'd fled from the rural areas where they had the most terrible experiences. Maybe their husbands had been decided to be condemned as being sellouts or something like that, and they were made to kill their husbands. You know, they'd had really horrible experiences. So it was what you would call it these days, anyway, therapy. The main thing he said they do during those group therapy things, he wasn't trained in that, but he just saw a need and facilitated it, was they were screaming, so they were his screaming women. When he came to Musami, he was there basically to help with the administration, but he used to go around the villages, you know, visiting and socializing and finding out what's going on. Yeah. The thing which disturbed him was he found a significant number of children who were disabled, right, who were kept out of the way, hidden in the hut, and the parents, you know, were ashamed of this child. And he was very disturbed by that. So he started bringing these kids and the parents into the mission, you know, for a day's session. Yes. Again, it's a bit like, it was similar. They weren't screaming like war widows, but they were, you know, they had their emotional problems. And he always he had a funny sense of humor. He loved them dearly, and he called them his wobblies. You know, because of the way they walked. He wasn't mocking them, it was an affectionate term. So just as they had his screaming, they had his wobblies. And that developed into the Pedro Arrupe Centre, which now focuses mainly on hearing impaired kids. So we've had quite a lot to do in that development.
Now, briefly, any personal wishes for Masami Mission, where you have worked for some time?
Personal wishes. Well, because I was so involved with the hospital,
You're right,
my personal wishes would always be regard to the hospital. And I do wish one could, in these rural hospitals, you could have a stable staff. Because we go out there every so often, and every time we go and say, how are things, we meet a new doctor, a new matron, a new administrator, and then a few months later, they've moved somewhere else, they've gone into town. It's an economic issue, and it's, other issues. But it would make a hell of a difference if you could have a doctor there who's going to stay for 5 years or longer, a matron there who's going to stay for 5 years or longer, and it would improve the whole healthcare.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Fr Nigel Johnson, for the interesting story of Musami, starting from that baboon encounter to the naming of the mission after a Mr. Musami. So our viewers, our friends, here we are. This is the story of Musami, and we hope to meet you yet again on another episode of Jesuit Historical Tracks.